You're listening to Engage Arizona, Public Policy for Daily Life. Today we are speaking with Emily Kao of Heritage Foundation about the extreme consequences of the Equality Act. The proposed legislation making its way through the nation's capital would affect nearly every aspect of life, including business, family, education, and more. You'll learn how this deceptive bill would impact your life. And now, here's Cindy Dahlgren.
Welcome to Engage Arizona. Today we are unpacking the Equality Act with Heritage Foundation's Emily Kao. Ms. Kao is the director of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. She's an attorney who has defended religious freedom for the last 14 years. She studied H.R. 5, or also known as the Equality Act, and its effects on society. Thank you, Emily, for your time. Will you start by giving us a brief synopsis of what the bill would do and a general description of the consequences of passing it, and then we'll go into more detail.
Thanks, Cindy, for having me on. So the Equality Act would add sexual orientation and gender identity to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In some cases, it would redefine sex as sexual orientation and gender identity. And that would have far-reaching consequences for all Americans. It would affect women and girls, it would affect parents and children, it would affect medical professionals, and both for-profit businesses and nonprofit charities, particularly religious charities.
Okay, so let's unpack it a little bit. So you're saying that it basically empowers the federal government to impose those civil and criminal punishments on citizens who basically just disagree with the sexual orientation, gender identity, ideology. That sounds a lot to me like a lot of government control, saying basically you have to agree with our beliefs. Am I understanding that right?
Absolutely. It would impose particular favored political viewpoints about sexual orientation and gender identity on the entire country. And anybody who dissents, whether it's based on disagreement about biology or it's based on religious beliefs or other reasons, could face punishment if they speak or act in a way that conflicts with the new definitions of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity that will be enshrined in civil rights law.
All right, so this is going to affect businesses and also those in medicine, right? Nurses, doctors. They would basically politicize that, forcing doctors and nurses to treat gender dysphoria according to transgender activists. Is that right? As opposed to maybe what their experience and expertise it dictates.
That's right. So it would silence some medical professionals, for instance, counselors who provide counseling for those struggling with same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. They would not be allowed to help children or adults feel comfortable with their own bodies. They would not be able to provide counseling for those who don't want to act upon same-sex attraction. And for those who are involved in providing hormonal or surgical treatments for regular illnesses, they could also be sued if they don't provide hormonal or surgical interventions for those suffering from gender dysphoria.
So even the doctors and nurses would be forced to treat people based on what the ideology of the day is, as opposed to what they've already learned to be useful and helpful based on their experience or expertise in biology.
That's right. So already in two states, Washington State and California, there have been lawsuits under state laws which have added sexual orientation and gender identity to non-discrimination provisions. In those two cases, Catholic hospitals were sued by individuals who identify as transgender. They would not provide, in one case, I believe it was a hysterectomy, to a perfectly healthy woman who wanted her uterus removed because she identifies as a man. Similarly with double mastectomies, which a hospital might provide for a cancer patient, if they choose not to provide that for a person struggling with gender dysphoria, they could be subject to a lawsuit.
Wow. And then, of course, this continues on to the parents as well. Talk a little bit about that. It's already happened in a couple of places. I'm thinking Ohio off the top of my head, where parents risk losing custody of their children if they do not go along with this.
Yeah, so the Equality Act would cut off avenues for parents to seek counseling for minors who are struggling with gender dysphoria. It would also make it extremely difficult to find a physician who is going to support, a process of what's called watchful waiting for minors who struggle with gender dysphoria. Because of the politicization of medicine that we just discussed, more and more medical professionals will go along with the transgender ideology's recommended gender-affirming care, which means hormonal interventions as young as 8 years old and eventually leading to surgical interventions at age 18. And we're already seeing these conflicts between parents and the recommendations of gender-affirming medical professionals be played out in multiple states. The case you mentioned in Ohio is one of the worst outcomes, which is that the parents ended up being subjected to child abuse charges by the county in Ohio after the Cincinnati Children's Medical Hospital said that the daughter should be taking testosterone for gender dysphoria. And once the county charged the parents with child abuse, the judge in the case ended up siding with both the hospital and the county, and they terminated the custody of the parents.
That just seems impossible, in America when you think about it. It seems like such an infringement on parental rights. But is that upheld in court? Do you know where that stands? I mean, I would imagine there was an appeal.
There's ongoing litigation regarding that particular case. But for now, the daughter is no longer in the custody of her parents. The custody has been transferred to another family member. So it should be an impossible outcome in America, but unfortunately it's not.
Wow. And if the Equality Act passes, then that just opens up the door for this to be widespread and throughout the country, because that's based on a state law or a local law, correct?
Absolutely. This kind of outcome could be replicated all over the United States. And in addition to what we just discussed, the conflict between medical professionals who affirm transgender ideology and parents, we also see the introduction of curriculum, LGBT curriculum, that the Equality Act could lead to as a real threat to parental rights.
Okay, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because that's one thing that we have not heard a lot about.
So the Equality Act could lead to the imposition of LGBT curricula not only in sex education, but in all subjects that children are taught from pre-K to high school, and even obviously in colleges and universities. So the Equality Act would allow federal courts to misappropriate some of the cases, the precedents that were set after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. So after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, to protect African Americans from discrimination, courts began to order schools to have Black history curriculum. And LGBT activists are already working in the states to pass laws mandating LGBT curricula. So we see the possibility that federal courts could also order schools to have LGBT curricula if the Equality Act were to pass.
Wow. And so can you elaborate on that? And what would that look like for, kindergartners, or then again in middle school?
So we've already seen in states like California, New Jersey, Illinois, Colorado, Washington State, and the District of Columbia that these states and DC have already passed laws mandating LGBT curriculum, not only in sex education, as I mentioned, but also teaching all throughout the curricula that historical figures like President James Buchanan, that they may have had same-sex attraction. And we've also seen that, transgender ideology is being taught to children even in pre-K, that they are being read books like I Am Jazz, and they're being taught that gender is fluid and that they can just choose their gender. And this is incredibly confusing for children of that age who can't really distinguish between reality and imagination. And we saw about a year ago, I think, in Rockland County, California, that kindergarten children who were read the story I Am Jazz became so confused they went home crying, afraid that they could just be turned into the opposite sex without them knowing it.
I can hear people already saying, though, that, if you don't like that, then, you have other options. You can go to, a private school or homeschool or something like that. And what would you say to that argument?
I'd say there are 15 million public school students in America, and there may be some who can afford to take their children out and put them in private schools. There may be parents who, both parents are there and one of them can homeschool. But I would say for a lot of American students and families, that's not the case. And so we shouldn't be making policy for exceptions. We should be making policy that serves the common good. Also, it's important to recognize that there are 10 states that have passed limitations on LGBT curricula, and I believe Arizona is one of them. And those prohibitions on LGBT curricula would be overridden by the Equality Act. If these new categories of sexual orientation and gender identity are added into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you will have federal courts making decisions about what curricula children are taught in public schools throughout the country, and that will override what states have decided to do.
Okay. Another area of concern, and I know I've seen this in the news a lot, is about the sports, women's sports, and how it would, the Equality Act would roll back many of the gains that women have made over the years. You wrote, "We must stand up for the truth that being female isn't a feeling or a social construct. It's a biological fact." Talk a little bit about that and how it relates to women's sports.
Well, sports are based on fairness. Fair competition in sports requires that we take into account physical realities when we make decisions about a physical activity. And the truth is that testosterone gives male athletes a huge advantage over women. There is actually no overlap between the levels of testosterone that men have and that women have. The ceiling for women's testosterone doesn't even reach the floor for men's testosterone. So when you have male athletes who are allowed to compete against females simply because that's their own self-perception, it creates an unfair playing field, and it will lead to the destruction of women's sports. Women won't have the opportunity to win. They'll just become bystanders in their own sports.
Yeah, and we've been seeing that time and time. And I saw an interview recently with a young woman who was defeated by two transgender athletes, and she was saying that when they got up, to the starting gate, they sort of felt defeated already. They knew that the race was already won.
That's right. That was a video that the Daily Signal produced about Selena Soul and some of her classmates in Connecticut. They described the outcomes of those races with the boys who identify as girls as heartbreaking. They said it was incredibly hurtful to see those boys winning their races because they all knew it was an unfair competition. They knew the outcome of the race before it even began. And the Equality Act has the potential to demoralize and discourage female athletes all across the country in future generations. Girls who haven't even had an opportunity to compete in sports yet. If the Equality Act were to pass, this would be, I think, an incredible discouragement to them to know that before they even enter the race's outcome is already decided.
Yeah, and I think about all the the hard-fought gains for women, and this is called the Equality Act. It doesn't sound at all like it would be equal for women or for doctors or for business people or anything for that matter. What do you say though to those who say, wow, this is just about making sure that those in the LGBTQ community are not discriminated against, and that these are just scare tactics?
Well, we agree that nobody should face discrimination simply because they are gay or transgender. What this act does is it doesn't create any objective definition of discrimination. There's Gender identity is completely self-referential, self-defined, and really the LGBT activists who are behind the Equality Act, they haven't been able to demonstrate that there is systematic evidence of discrimination against LGBT people simply because they're gay or transgender. What they have put forward in their arguments is that disagreement about marriage or disagreement about gender identity constitutes discrimination. But we live in a pluralistic society where everyone should be able to hold their own viewpoints, and we should be able to disagree about these matters in the public square with civility. But unfortunately, the Equality Act would basically end disagreement in public by punishing those who dissent from the reigning cultural orthodoxies on sexual orientation and gender identity.
Now, I recently heard that the Equality Act could also affect abortion laws. Can you talk about that? Are you aware of that aspect of it?
Yes, I believe that there are many pro-life groups that are opposing the Equality Act now because, again, the addition of sex to some of the provisions in the Equality Act, like the public accommodations provision, it could open the door wide for lawsuits that argue that abortion is sex discrimination. And so that's why this is an incredibly pro-abortion bill.
Okay, and that's in regard to they say it's sex discrimination because there are not these limitations on sort of related procedures for men, correct? Is that how they get there?
Well, there's nothing in this act that clearly explains, as there is in other legislation, that a hospital or a medical professional's refusal to provide abortion is not sex discrimination. So it's opening the door to litigation against hospitals and medical providers who don't want to facilitate an abortion. It will be argued that that is discrimination on the basis of sex against women.
If you could talk a little bit about how this will affect just everybody's daily lives as far as forcing all public accommodations to be open to both boys and girls and men and women, whether it be in schools or gyms or wherever, their locker rooms, restrooms, things like that.
Yeah, so we would see a nationwide transgender bathroom policy. When you go to the gym, locker rooms would be open to anyone of either sex who identifies as the opposite sex. For children in schools, it would have huge impact, not only the curriculum that we talked about, but if they go on overnight trips and they're staying in a hotel, they could be forced to share a room with somebody of the opposite sex who identifies as transgender. And then also the restrictions on speech. There would be compelled speech if preferred pronoun policies are adopted, which the Equality Act would lead to. So there would be preferred pronoun policies in workplaces and in schools. So also those lawsuits that we've already seen in the wedding industry against Jack Phillips and Brush and Nib and Bernal Stutzman, we would just see those mushroom all over the country. But it would be also disagreement on gender identity, not only the meaning of marriage.
Thank you so much for the work that you do at the Heritage Foundation and for taking the time to help us better understand the Equality Act and what it's really all about. For those who want to read more about what Emily is writing, her work can be found at heritage.org. Thank you, Emily Kao.